Welcome to another episode of Breakthrough Dialogues, the podcast for pragmatists and problem solvers brought to you by the Breakthrough Institute. I'm Alex Trembath, your host and deputy director at Breakthrough. Another quick reminder before we get going. A couple weeks from now, my producer Tali Perlman and I will be hosting the very first Breakthrough Dialogues AMA, or Ask Me Anything, episode. So if you have questions you'd like us to answer, please either email us at info@thebreakthrough.org or tweet us at @thebti or at @atrembath. We'll be collecting the questions over the coming weeks, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. For this episode, I spoke with Margot Finn. Margot is a food studies scholar at the University of Michigan, and she's the author of the excellent 2017 book, Discriminating Taste: How Class Anxiety Created the American Food Revolution. She's also the author of an essay in the most recent issue of the Breakthrough Journal titled Food Injustice. Margot makes the surprising but I think quite compelling case that the things food movements often care about, local food, urban gardens, fresh fruits and vegetables, actually have less impact on health and social and economic outcomes than commonly assumed. It's a provocative argument that has earned some accolades and some pushback from food system scholars, and we talk a little bit about that reaction in this conversation. Margot Finn, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. We're going to talk about food culture, food justice movements, food and nutrition, food and health and economic outcomes. And I thought a good place to start would be by asking you, what is the sort of conventional telling of what foods are virtuous and what foods are inferior?
I think there's actually a couple of different strains that compete. I don't know that there's one singular one, but the dominant, I think, idea of good food that has emerged, in large part credit to people like Michael Pollan and documentaries like Food Inc. in the kind of mid-2000s, late 2000s, is this idea that it should be organic, it should be fresh, it should be locally grown if possible, this idealized vegetable and fruit centric diet that comes from farmers nearby that you can know and ask about what their practices are. I think that seems to be central to it. This idea of feeling connected to food that is fresh and healthy and grown with care for the environment. I think that's what people are largely seeking.
Right. And you mentioned, obviously, Michael Pollan, documentaries like Food Inc. In your book, you lay out where this convention comes from in more detail. So I was hoping you could unpack that for us for a little bit.
Oh, sure. Well, I think I got interested in food at that moment, along with a lot of other people, due to books like The Omnivore's Dilemma. But when I started researching it, I found that a lot of these ways of thinking about food seemed to get popular in the 1980s in the US or become popular again. Really, what I found is that the interest in things like gourmet food and weight loss dieting and ethnic food that had really shaped my own food consciousness were a real sea change in the 1980s away from the sort of mid-century interest in reliable food, frugal food, American food, really kind of nationalist in a sense that was not looking towards ethnic foods as part of America, but in fact, trying to define American foods against ethnic foods. So the real sea change that kind of brought us, I think, the dominant food culture that we're working with today happened in the 80s. But what was even more fascinating to me as I looked into the history is that there was really similar conversation going on about food between about 1880 and 1920 or the Great Depression, where people were also concerned about the purity of their food. They were also really interested in international cuisines and the new foods being brought by the immigrant populations that were coming at that moment. And a real interest in new kinds of dieting for thinness, which had not been a focus of dieting prior to that moment. So it depends. So where does it come from? I guess it depends on how far back you want to go. And then some of those strains. So vegetarianism, for example, it kind of cycles through at different. It becomes interesting to people at different points in time for different reasons. And I think you see similar things with the idea of thinness or the idea of freshness, or the idea of a food that's grown with a particular kind of sensibility about nature. The details around how those things work change. So it's not always going to be called sustainability, but the idea that you're growing food with an attention to its relationship to nature is something that does come back at different moments. I don't know if that, I think I lost track of the question a little bit, but
no, not at all. It's a really fascinating subject. We've spoken to food historian Rachel Loudon, whose work I know you enjoy. We had Alan Levinovitz on the podcast last year to talk about the sort of connection between food and diet and nature and spirituality. And it's just really interesting, as a starting point to realize how sort of society's views on food and our connection with food have changed so dramatically over time, and to place our sort of modern views on food and food systems in that context.
Yeah, and I think like where I'm struggling is that it depends on like where things come from depends on what you're talking about and what's important to you about that thing. So like sustainability discourse starts at a certain moment, but it's not like that's the first time people have been concerned about how food affects the environment. So if it's that bigger arc that you want to trace, well, that goes back much further. So these, trying to figure out when things begin is it's tricky. It's hard to place.
Sure, and I want to focus on some arguments that you make in your more recent essay about sort of more modern fads, trends, views on food systems. And I want to start with one of the more surprising arguments you make in your essay, which is around fruits and vegetables. I think we all know that we should all eat more fruits and vegetables, sort of maximize our intake of them because it's obviously healthy. We all grow up knowing that. So I want to get into questions about sort of processed food. I want to get into questions about fast food, but I wanted to start with the fruits and vegetables question because I think for a lot of people it'll be provocative and really interesting and surprising. So what does the evidence tell us about consumption of fruits and vegetables?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a big question. And let me try and take a couple of the parts of it. So one part of what makes that question difficult and good is that we don't have very good ways of measuring what people actually eat. So that's the first problem in nutrition research, really, is that a whole lot of nutrition research uses what are called what are considered or sometimes classified as memory-based measures that measure what people eat based on asking them, some period of time afterwards, what they ate, and they try to recreate for you what they've eaten. One way of doing this is called food frequency questionnaires. That's what the National Health and Nutrition Examination, that's what the NHANES typically uses. Sometimes they also do targeted 24-hour recall. That's a different kind of memory-based measure. But the problem with all of these is that people are not always very good at remembering what they've eaten. And the food frequency questionnaires in particular, some versions of them will ask about a period of time as long as a year. So you get this whole series, this whole battery really of questions about what you've eaten and how much. And it's things like, how many grapefruits have you eaten in the last year? And if the answer is one every day, 365, that's a very easy thing to answer. Or if the answer is 0, I hate grapefruits, that's a pretty good answer. But if you eat grapefruits sometimes, and particularly if you might eat them seasonally, or you go through a period of time where you eat a lot of them, maybe in the winter when there's not a lot of other produce that you like, but then the rest of the year you don't eat very many at all, it's really hard to estimate with any kind of accuracy how much grapefruit you've consumed. So you answer this whole series of questions about how often you eat soup and mixed foods, and then based on that, they estimate what your fruit and vegetable consumption is, and then they correlate that with health outcomes that they can track. So this is a fairly crude way to try to estimate the effects of something as broad and kind of slippery as a category as fruits and vegetables on health outcomes. When you have enough data, it's worth sifting through and seeing if you can find anything. But when we do checks to see how reliable these memory-based measures are at telling us how much people probably actually eat or what they're eating more of and less of, the reliability checks are not good. So if you throw out data that there's some studies where they'll decide that there's a range of biological plausibility. And often it's something like you have to be saying that you have to report that you're eating at least 600 calories a day, but not more than, say, 5,000 or 6,000. And they'll end up throwing out something like 40 to 60% of the data because people are reporting that they're eating either habitually eating fewer than 600 calories a day or more than 6,000 calories a day. but they keep the rest of the data. Like if you're not, in at those two extremes, then they keep the data and call it good. And I'm not any more convinced that the rest of the people who are falling in that range are necessarily doing so because they have reported their consumption accurately. I think that just their inaccuracies don't happen to fall that far outside of biological plausibility. But that doesn't give me confidence that taking those food frequencies, taking even a large population and saying, okay, based on this, we're going to decide that this category, fruits and vegetables, that the people who, and correlate it. Well, for one, the correlations aren't that strong, but whether or not that has any relationship to the actual effects of these foods on people's health, I think is a pretty open question. And there's so many other just data problems. There's definitely differences. I think most people have a sense of this between how different individuals process and consume food. So the same food is not going to have the same effect on different people. There's even differences day to day. Many people will experience, if you have something really stressful coming up, you might have some GI distress. Probably that affects how the things that you have consumed affect your health, right? If you just throw everything up that you ate, it's not going to have the same effect on your health as if you digest it. But similarly, if you have, stress-induced GI issues that cause everything to go out the other end, you're also not probably going to be digesting it the same. So there's like all these complications with food and eating. And I'm not sure that taking these food frequency surveys and then correlating them with health outcomes and then seeing that the correlations aren't even that strong, like, does that actually tell us anything about what fruits and vegetables do to our health? Another data problem is that fruits and vegetables, it's like, that's a really big category. And if we're talking about just servings of fruits and vegetables, then presumably somebody who eats, say, 4 servings of blueberries every day, could categorically be in the same group as somebody who eats, a couple of avocados and some potatoes most days. And I don't know that there's any reason to think that the blueberries are going to have an equivalent effect on somebody's health as avocados and potatoes. These are really different foods. And yet, if we're just going to take that category, fruits and vegetables, and think that people should eat more of them, all of those things, well, potatoes sometimes get cut out. And that's another part of the complexity, right? Are white potatoes a vegetable? Does it not if they're French fries, but yes if they're baked? This is the morass that we're starting with, and it turns out that based on the data that we have, it doesn't seem like eating a whole lot more fruits and vegetables, at least for the populations that we've looked at for a long time, have much better health outcomes or live a whole lot longer. Now, maybe they're doing something else for people's health, and maybe there's health is also a difficult thing to measure, right? So longevity isn't necessarily the only thing we care about. Is it true that people who eat a whole lot more of this big category that we call fruits and vegetables are living more high quality disease-free days? I'm not sure there's great data to show that. I would love to see it if there is any, but the studies that I've seen suggest to me that there's not a whole lot of meaningful difference between the people who eat very few or report that they eat very few fruits and vegetables and the people who eat a whole super lot.
Yeah, this is one sort of insight that keeps cropping up in my reading over the last few years that is really fascinating and not very satisfying, which is that, so we know how big the universe is, we know how gravity works, we know like the scientific revolution over the last couple centuries has been remarkable, and we still don't have a very good grip on sort of nutrition and on sort of human nutrition and on the effects of different food groups and volumes of different foods on the human body, just because there's so much variation. There are so many confounding factors to the point where I have a hard time coming away from any of it with any conclusion other than, try not to eat too much and try to eat a relatively balanced diet.
And even those are pretty complicated questions. Like, what is too much and how would you know it?
Right.
Do you only know too much if you are fatter than you want to be? Is that fatness actually causing negative health outcomes? Stigma is definitely a problem. So if it causes you to be stigmatized, I can see where that's a problem. But that's not usually, I think, what people are thinking about when they're thinking about health issues that would be caused by food.
Sure.
Yeah. So what was it? You said not too much, and then there was and balanced. But that's a good question. A balance between what and what? I don't envy people who are trying to tell people how to eat. That's not an easy task.
Yeah, certainly. Speaking of sort of slippery and difficult to pin down concepts, I do want to talk about processed food for a moment. which is something I find it something of a catch-all term to basically mean food that's bad for you. In your essay, you talk about how both the terms fresh and processed are kind of vague and fluid. So I wanted to ask you how, in your estimation, how do these terms get deployed in the world?
I think you're right. I think processed basically means bad right now, and fresh more or less means good. I mean, people do associate it with food that has not been processed as much. Although some of our foods that are fresh go through quite a lot of processing. Milk is, I think, an example that I used in the essay. Fresh milk is pasteurized, at least. That is a kind of processing. But it does seem to, or with freshness, I think in particular, connote a certain kind of it's a closeness to production. People often talk about what makes lobster so special is that it's the freshest food that you can eat because it's killed directly before your meal specifically for you. And I don't even know. I think that in that case, the freshness is there's something about the luxury or power associated with being able to command that, right? Like, you are going to kill that large sea insect for me. But that's sort of I don't know. Is that actually how that works? In other cases, I mean, there is a difference between a fresh pea and a frozen pea. I don't think it's a nutritional difference, but it's going to taste different. One had to be picked and transported in a way that's usually a little bit more resource intensive, and that often is why it's more expensive and possibly something richer people are going to buy, and that then gets associated with wealth and privilege and virtue in the ways that behaviors associated with rich people are. So fresh and then versus processed. And I have to say there's a lot of research suggesting that people who eat a whole lot more of what sometimes gets called highly processed foods seem to have worse health outcomes. I'm not sure if that's a result of the highly processed food or a result of the other kinds of life circumstances that might cause somebody to eat a whole lot of highly processed foods. But I'm not a nutritionist, and I don't have an exhaustive knowledge of the public health literature, but that is something that people focus on, I think, because there must be a stronger correlation there than there is for some kinds of health behavior, diet behaviors and health effects. I'm definitely farther away from the question than I need to be at this point.
No, not at all. Another sort of surprising finding that you surfaced in your writing is actually that the sort of types of assumptions that we often make about who eats more processed food, who eats more fast food, who eats more fresh food, is not actually very well borne out in the data either. So it's not clear that sort of lower income people eat more fast food and rich people eat more fresh food. There's a whole bunch of variation across the demographics there. And I was just hoping that you could unpack that for us a little bit too.
Sure. Yeah, the fast food thing is fascinating. I have this file of screenshots that I keep of headlines about research about the fact that poor people don't seem to eat more fast food and how surprising it is. And like every 3 to 4 years, there's a whole new batch of, wait, poor people don't eat more fast food? Wait, what? The middle class eats the most fast? It's endlessly surprising, which is a funny thing, right? So there was a study that came out in 2007, and there was a whole batch of headlines of the middle class actually eats the most fast food, and the poor people are. And then 2011, I think, was the next one that I have a whole, and it's CNN is surprised every time. Time magazine is surprised every time. It's just endlessly surprising to people that poor people don't actually eat more fast food. And I think that's because we hear this story again and again. And there's a lot of things that contribute to it. So for one, fast food is a lot less expensive than other kinds of restaurant food. The differences in the labor structure of a restaurant that does table service versus counter service is significant. And so the cost can be lower. And so people think of it as a cheap kind of meal, which it is relative to other restaurant food. It's just not a cheap meal relative to the food that people cook at home, which is what poor people do by necessity because it's so much cheaper. So it is, it's like, you can see why people believe these things. And then, of course, there's a whole lot of media kinds of things that reinforce these stories because they're the stories that seem to make sense to us, that seem to reflect the world. And then we go into the world and we perceive the world based on these categories too. So sometimes what I do in talks is there's a great series of pictures of people from McDonald's, and you can put them up and ask people things like, which of these people do you think belong in this McDonald's? And which of these people do you think are just occasional visitors? And that's the lens that we use when we walk into a McDonald's. If you ever do, you see some people as like habitual customers, and some people as people who are just here because maybe they're on a road trip or something, but they don't eat here all the time. They're not McDonald's eaters. But these are all people who are in the same restaurant. So maybe nobody else does this. I do this. I walk into places and some people look comfortable and some people look at home and some people look like they belong there and some people don't. Or I feel like I belong somewhere and I don't feel like I belong somewhere else. And I think these things affect what we assume other people do maybe more powerfully than any data. Like, I don't know if anybody ever looked at a study that actually tried to measure how much fast food people eat before they decided that poor people must eat more of it. I don't think these things come from the data. I think we have these ideas, and then a lot of the data that we generate ends up fitting those ideas too, because we're human, and that's how we shape our questions, and that's how we do our research.
Yeah, and now that we're talking about class, one of the arguments you make is that a whole bunch of the assumptions and the sort of views that we have about our food consumption are born, at least partially, from class anxiety. So can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. I think particularly since about 1980, as income inequality has expanded so dramatically, and mobility, particularly for the middle classes, has stalled. So there's just not the sense anymore, because this is, I think, actually a case where people's perception is reflecting a true fact. People cannot expect their kids to do better than them. For a long time, I think there was an expectation that many, many people's kids would do better than them. And maybe many people's kids still will, but it feels like the contract has been broken. So that hard work and sticking in school and getting to college is not necessarily going to yield a secure and dignified life, a job that you can have some kind of respect and dignity in, resources that might enable you to raise a family with some kind of security. Those promises aren't there. And I think that makes people anxious. It makes me anxious. It should make people anxious. It's a sad, scary thing that many of the things that we thought of as the way the world works don't seem to be in the post-1980s US. And I think one thing that people end up doing is trying to compensate for the idea that they might aspire to a more solid, dignified life, or a kind of status that is worth inhabiting, a kind of identity that is respected by our culture, that has dignity in it. People want these things, they need these things, and if they can't get them by by seeking a job that gives you that kind of security and dignity, if jobs aren't going to do it, you can find it elsewhere. And one of the ways that I think people have truly found a sense of dignity and meaning and a way of differentiating themselves and creating for themselves an identity that they can inhabit and look at themselves in the mirror and like themselves, is by using things like food or home decorating or clothing, or there's all these other sartorial or taste kinds of signs that we use to inhabit an identity that we want to inhabit. And that's at least my theory for why all of these ways of trying to eat better that aren't compatible, that don't make sense together, that aren't evidence-based, that don't do the things that we want them to do or think that they will do, might have flourished at this moment of increasing income inequality and stagnating class mobility. I think that the reason people started trying to eat better in all of these ways that don't make sense either with each other or with the goals is because those were all ways of trying to make themselves into something good, at a moment where class aspiration is broken.
Sure, and in your essay, you sort of build on these questions. You describe a food justice movement that is reacting to a whole bunch of these messy signals from nutrition and from class and from social and economic pressures. And you I think mostly describe a food justice movement that's out of step with the demands of low income or disadvantaged communities. So I wanted to ask you if you think that is a sort of a fair reading of your essay, and for you to unpack that for us.
Sure. Yeah, I think that is a fair reading of it. And I should say, and I should clarify, and some of the critical response to the essay that I think is really fair has pointed out that it might be true that that's more a critique of the popular perception of food justice than it is actual food justice organizations. And that could be completely valid. I have done no work with any extant food justice organizations. People who want to call me an armchair critic, that's fair. I sit in a chair most of the time. I do most of my research with a laptop and an internet connection. Um, and and if I have mischaracterized what people who are campaigning for food justice are actually doing, then I regret that. And that is a mistake that I will endeavor to correct. I'm doing a lot of reading right now, in fact, to try and figure that out. But I have to say, in my initial reading, I'm really not convinced I got the popular idea of food justice wrong. And whether or not I got the kind of empirical question of what do the majority of people campaigning for food justice actually want and do wrong, that I'm not sure about yet. I'm looking into it. But as far as I can tell, the popular perception of food justice, of what that term refers to, really has been often people of color led campaigns to increase the access to locally grown fresh fruits and vegetables, particularly in urban areas, although there's been some attention to the fact that many rural areas in the US are also quote unquote food deserts, another term that's a difficult thing we could talk about if we have all day. If that's not what food justice is doing, then I don't have a problem with food justice. If what people are doing when they're campaigning for food justice is truly trying to improve working conditions and correct for systematic racism and inequality and ensure that there are good, decent paths to good, decent jobs for people instead of paths directly into prison. If we could contemplate getting rid of prisons and pursuing restorative justice, I think these kinds of things would actually enable people to possibly eat better, whatever that even means. I think it would help them eat more like they want to eat. And for me, that's what I want for people. I want people to be able to eat how they want to eat. And if the food justice movement is focused exclusively on providing fresh fruits and vegetables grown locally, I don't think that's how everybody wants to eat. In fact, I don't think that's how anybody wants to eat all the time. And I don't think that's how everybody wants to eat at all. So I guess I've taken the criticism to heart that maybe this is not really what food justice is doing, but I think it's certainly what rich white people thought food justice was doing. So we can at least maybe try to correct that misconception that that's necessarily a good goal for everybody to be aiming for. But if food justice is not about growing fresh fruits and vegetables in urban areas, then I have been very misled by basically all of the media coverage of what food justice is.
Yeah, I watched some of this reaction to your essay on Twitter and online, and it seems like some of your critics are sort of giving sort of helpful, constructive feedback about the complexity and the variance in food justice movements. But really, at a high level, I saw kind of two things. You've got folks saying that you've mischaracterized food justice movements. But then at the same time, so often the same people are criticizing your empirical argument about the impacts of sort of local fresh fruits and vegetables on communities. And it seems like you can't really have it both ways. You can either be mischaracterizing the food justice movement as a whole, or your assessment of the food justice movement can be accurate. Or can be inaccurate. But at the same time, as these folks are saying, Margot, that you're completely mischaracterizing the food justice movement. And by the way, all these things you're saying about in your critique are wrong. And actually, it is good to be focusing on local fresh fruits and vegetables for low income and disadvantaged communities. That is the work that we should be doing. Those seem like mutually exclusive criticisms to some degree, at least. And from a third party standpoint, it honestly felt a bit like a gaslighting of you. Sort of trying to take apart your critique and your sort of scientific observations on this in a bunch of ways that actually don't comport with each other.
Yeah, it was hard to square those two reactions with each other, honestly. No, you're wrong. Food justice has actually all been about workers and getting rid of prisons and getting compassionate drug rehab or compassionate addiction care for people, and all of these things. We've all been doing all of those things already. Which, if so, great. Then honestly, you're right. I have no argument, and I will be quiet, because if food justice is already really campaigning against all of the things that I think are really causing problems in poor communities, then awesome. Let's highlight those great activities. I would like to hear more about them, and I would like those to be the thing that we hear about when we talk about food justice. If, on the other hand, the problem is that I just got it all wrong, poor people want fresh fruits and vegetables, they should have them, and it would make their lives a whole lot better to get them, there ought to be some good evidence for that, and I would like people to send me the citations.
Yeah, I should say that I'm not exactly a neutral observer here. I loved your essay, and obviously it was published in our journal. But I reacted strongly and negatively to it in a couple places, like a lot of people did. It just feels wrong to me that sort of higher consumption of fruits and vegetables isn't obviously correlated with better health and maybe even other better social and economic outcomes. And you know that put me in. It was some uncomfortable knowledge for me that I had to sit with for a while. So I just wanted to ask, how much of this do you think is driven by these really deep seated psychological and emotional connections that we draw between food and lifestyle, and sort of what we think of as a good society?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's astute. I think it's interesting to hear from you that you had that experience too. I guess I wonder. So when you were reading those things about, well, maybe fresh fruits and vegetables that aren't at least don't seem to meaningfully extend people's lives very much. Maybe it improves cardiovascular health a tiny bit. As you were reading those things, did you think about, like, if you did think those things are true, so why? What do you have a sense of, like, so it's not like you saw, I don't think anybody comes to these beliefs through evidence, right? I don't think that most people are like, oh, well, yeah, no, there was a study that I read and it showed me that people who eat 7 servings of fresh fruits and vegetables are much more likely to live to 80 years old than people who eat this many servings. And so that's the dose, and here are my odds, and I'm going to make a rational decision to do that. Most people, I don't think, come to that belief that way. And so I wonder, I don't know, I guess I wonder about the response. I wonder what it does to somebody to have, well, like, so we thought that this was true, but here's the evidence. And actually the evidence suggests you can kind of maybe eat whatever you want. You'd think that would be liberating, but that is not my experience at all. I think most people experience that as a profound threat. And it's probably because we care a whole lot about knowing what is good for us. And it's upsetting to find out that maybe what we thought was good for us isn't. It's just destabilizing, right? If fresh fruits and vegetables aren't healthy, what is healthy? That's a great question. I don't know that I have a great answer for it. It's such a good question.
Right. And you sort of propose a couple different answers in your book and in your essay. Part of it is this is just what the nutrition guidelines have been telling us since we were kids. Some of it is obviously connected to class and class differentiation. As you say, some of it is the sort of sense of virtue that is given or earned by denying pleasure. So if I don't eat, cheesy nachos, but I eat carrots, then I'm sort of denying myself pleasure, but I get a little bit of virtue, a little bit of pleasure from somewhere else by feeling that I made the right decision. I am actually not one of these, a crazy health nut. I eat fast food sometimes. I eat what people would call processed food pretty frequently. Diet Coke is probably my favorite food in the world. But then I do make sure to get the baby carrots or the celery. I do make sure to get a bunch of vegetables on a regular basis, because even if I am sort of having pasta or tacos or whatever on a regular basis, I feel some sort of need to throw the fruits and vegetables in there. First of all, I do tend to like them, so I don't feel like I'm denying myself a pleasure or anything. But I also have this urge to eat them because I feel like I have to eat them.
Yeah. The pleasure thing is interesting. So I think fruits and vegetables are really pleasurable too. I want people to have fruits and vegetables because I think they bring people joy. And I think that's important for people's health, frankly, possibly more than micronutrients. Probably. I think joy is, I'm going to go on record saying I think joy is more important than micronutrients. But oh gosh, what was I going to? Oh, the pleasure and virtue thing. Yeah, I think that that's a lot of it too. But what's interesting is it's because fresh fruits and vegetables have been constructed as good for your health that I think people often think of them as virtuous and not pleasurable when really they are. There's this fabulous historian, Helen Zoe Veit, I believe her name. I haven't heard her name pronounced out loud either, so that's probably wrong. She wrote Modern Food, Moral Food was her first book. But the book that she's working on, I think the working title is Picky, and it's about kids' eating habits. And one thing that's fascinating is before fruits and vegetables were seen as healthy foods, when they were actually seen as not very healthy because they didn't have a whole lot of calories, they weren't going to fill you up and make you big and strong. People thought of kids as really liking fresh, not just fresh fruits and vegetables in general. That like one of the hallmark of being an immature eater, a child having childish tastes, was to want to eat everything, whether or not it was the good filling stuff that was going to, get you big and strong and the stuff that you should be eating, the bland porridge. Instead, it was like kids, if you let kids, they'll just eat pickles and fruit all day, and that's not going to do anything for them. So it's funny that today now we think of kids as not liking fruits and vegetables, as having to be taught, taste education to help these kids learn to like their kale. And I don't think any of that has anything to do with how humans inherently respond to any kind of food. I think it has to do with our ideas about what's good for us in health terms, what tastes good, whether or not pleasure is good or bad for us in a kind of in a much bigger sense than just food.
Yeah, I love having these conversations again with folks like you, Rachel Loudon, and Alan Levinovitz, because I keep being reminded that we have actually been sort of studying and paying attention to the relationship that people and societies have with food, not just for like the last 20 years since the rise of, the Food Network and Michael Pollan, but that, we've been paying attention to these things for a long time. And the relationship has shifted in so many fascinating ways. So to think that whatever the sort of common sense or sort of common wisdom about food that exists today is either the ultimate or the correct one, is sort of, as you say, destabilized by that more historical sense and by a lot of the evidence. And it does create this interesting friction in our minds, and it can be uncomfortable. But I have at times found it liberating, as you say.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's like it at first it feels awful because it feels like you got some structure taken away, and that structure felt meaningful to you. But once the structure is real, once you settle in to the walls not being there, wow, you can see a whole lot farther, and that's cool.
I like to close these conversations by asking our guests what makes you hopeful in the world. And I wonder, sort of inclusive maybe of some of the feedback you've gotten on your essay, what makes you hopeful about justice movements in general, maybe food justice movements in particular?
Well, one thing that's been cool is to the extent that I may have truly mischaracterized the food justice movement, the way people have been correcting me is the best, is they just keep sending me these awesome examples of people who really are working on all of the issues that I care so much about, right? Like the people who really are working to try to fight abuses of immigrants, whether they're in the farm fields or not. The people who really are working to reform our criminal justice system. The people who are working on getting decent universal health care. So that's been great. So I guess all of that gives me tons of hope. It's not like I'm the only one who has looked at the world and said, maybe vegetables aren't justice, but hey, there's a whole lot of other problems. That's actually been the best thing, is that people just keep sending me these lovely examples of people doing exactly the kind of work that I think is so urgent.
Wonderful. Margot Finn, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning into Breakthrough Dialogues. If you like our show, tell your friends, rate us, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or whatever platform you get your podcasts. Like I mentioned at the top of the episode, please send us your questions for our upcoming AMA episode, either by emailing info@thebreakthrough.org or tweeting @thebti or @atrembath. I want to again thank my guests, Margot Finn, and our producers, Alyssa Kadaman and Tali Perlman. Catch you next time.